Welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Alan Eagle, Google's Director of Communications. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Good to talk to you.
So Alan has written a book along with Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, along with Jonathan Rosenberg, the former head of product at Google, called $1 Trillion Coach, about an extraordinary guy named Bill Campbell. And we'll talk about that in a moment. It's really an extraordinary book and an extraordinary story. But I'd love to get a sense of what was your path here to the point where you're writing a book with Eric Schmidt? That's a fairly exalted place to be in the world, I would say.
It's pretty serendipitous. I've been at Google about 12 years. My first job at Google, Jonathan hired me to be his head of communications and sort of pseudo chief of staff. And as part of that role, I ended up having a small team, and we worked on speeches for Eric Schmidt and for Jonathan, of course, who was head of product at the time, and a few other Googlers like Marissa Mayer, Susan Wojcicki. And we did not PR style communications, but just speeches primarily. And so we started doing that. And about 4 years into it, I actually worked on a speech for Jonathan, an internal talk, which was ironically called, Principles from the Bestseller I'll Never Write. And it was an internal speech for a sales conference. And he made the speech. It got recorded. It went around the company, went a little bit viral within the company. And Eric saw it and said, well, that's kind of interesting. Maybe we should write a book.
Wow.
And so we did. And, at Google, we have this concept of a 20% project where you can work on things that are not really part of your day job. The freedom to do it as long as you're doing your day job, okay? And so our first book was How Google Works.
Right.
And it was not in my job title to write books.
Right.
But that's what we did. So we published that in 2014.
And how did it come to be in your job title to write speeches? Because you went to, was it Wharton where you started?
Yeah. If you go back, I'm a Bay Area native. I grew up here in the Valley.
Yep. And
I went to Dartmouth, studied computer science. And then I've worked in the Valley ever since in mostly product management and sales and business development roles, got my MBA at Wharton. Yeah. But I always really liked the communications aspect of sales and product marketing and so on. And so I don't recall exactly how I came to be talking with Jonathan about coming to join Google in more of a communications capacity. I don't really know. Full disclosure, Jonathan and I are friends dating back to junior high.
Wow.
We grew up in Palo Alto together.
That's amazing.
And so I'm not really sure how we got the idea that I could do this job, but it worked out pretty well.
And how have you seen, Google is I remember when Google was just a little office and Larry and Sergey bumping around a little bit. How have you enjoyed the different stages as this has become a much different operation, I assume, than when you first joined it?
Well, I just love Google. I love that we stand for something, and that we have a culture that cares about, the things that we stand for and not just making money. I think we're as much an institution as a company. That has been tested as we grow, but I think the culture is still very strong. So, we have a lot of debate, and a lot of it is public, and people take that as a bad sign, but I don't.
Right.
We have a place where people feel empowered to stand up and speak up if they don't like what's going on, and they do. And so it gets pretty noisy.
Sure.
So that really hasn't changed. Of course, the company, when I joined, we were a few thousand people, and even then people were talking about, Google doesn't feel like a startup anymore. And, people still say that.
And what is it now, 50,000 or 30,000?
No, we're 110,000 employees, I think, plus, contractors and so on. So it's a very large company, but I still think, we still stand for something, and we're proud of that.
What an amazing path. Let's talk about $1 Trillion Coach and this book you've written about a guy named Bill Campbell. And just to begin, the book begins, and I found this kind of extraordinary. It begins with the scene. It's a memorial service for Bill in the warm California sunshine. What strikes me about this service is that in Silicon Valley, everybody is there. Sheryl Sandberg is there. John Doerr is there. Multiple CEOs from Google are there. And what struck me about it,
Mary Meeker,
everybody,
Ruth Porat, yes.
And what strikes me about it is you think about. It never happens in Silicon Valley. It happens in LA. It happened at the Oscars and the Emmys. Everybody who's anybody's there. It happens in New York. I think the Met Gala. Everybody who's anybody in New York is there. There's nothing like that in Silicon Valley. And yet this guy, Bill Campbell, had this unique outpouring that I've never heard of before or since. who is this guy? What?
Well, Bill was really quite a remarkable guy. He grew up in western Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh, played football in high school, and football helped get him to Columbia in Manhattan, of course, in the early 60s, where wasn't a big guy, maybe 5'10", maybe 160, but he played both ways in the early 60s for Columbia, offensive lineman and I believe linebacker, and helped win the Ivy League championship, still Columbia's only Ivy League championship in football, and went on to coach football for 12 years. And this is part of, I think, what made him who he was later in life, was that experience of coaching football. He coached at Boston College as an assistant and then was head coach at Columbia in the late 70s. Now, if you know anything about college football, Columbia then and now, actually now they've finally gotten quite good, but for many, many years, Columbia was a terrible football program.
Now, I actually do know this because I went to Northwestern, and when I was there, it had the longest losing streak in NCAA history, broken only by eventually Columbia. So,
well, and now they're both pretty good.
They're both fine now. Yeah, exactly.
So that's good. So he coached football until age 39. So pretty remarkable. He did not start his business career till he was 39 years old. It was 1980, joined J. Walter Thompson, the ad agency. One of his main client was Kodak. Jumped over to Kodak, and then rose through the ranks at Kodak pretty quickly, and then somewhere along the way met John Scully. And when John came west to take over Apple as CEO of Apple, he invited Bill. Right. And Bill came to Apple. And so in 1979, he was coaching football for Columbia. By 1984, he was head of sales for Apple and overseeing the launch of the Mac. And, his Valley career took off from there.
And then from there, he ends up at Intuit as well. Is that right?
He was at Apple, and then Apple had a software spinoff you may remember called Claris.
That's right.
In the late 80s. So he became CEO of Claris.
Yeah, right.
And then Apple, they were supposed to spin it off and have its own IPO, and they pulled Claris back in, and that's when Bill left, and he went to Go. There was a very well-known book called Startup about Go, and Bill was CEO of Go. Right. And then when Go folded, or as Bill used to say, Go didn't go, he ended up as CEO of Intuit for several years.
And what were people seeing at this time? That is a very short trajectory to being CEO of Intuit.
Yeah.
But football coach, and somehow all these people are just seeing something amazing in this guy, even before he starts being the coach to the Silicon Valley greats.
Well, he was just a successful operator and a good business person and a good manager. And up until I think maybe when he took over Intuit, that's when people started to see something even more special. In the book, we have an interview with Scott Cook, who was the founder and at the time the CEO of Intuit. Right. So Bill was the first CEO after Scott Cook. That's quite to follow the founder as a CEO is quite an act. And we interviewed Scott, and Scott said, when he first talked to Bill, I thought, all right. And he wasn't that impressed, and he kept interviewing other people. But then he came back to Bill, and the second time, I think the first time they had spoken on the phone, and the second time they just went for a walk. Mm-hmm. And Bill was famous for his walks around Palo Alto. He and Steve Jobs used to do it all the time. Right. I just wish one day I had seen those guys walking down the street, and just followed them and tried to listen.
That's right. That's right.
But
because the conversations, as I understood it, were not just they were about business, but they were also about the range of their personal lives as well.
Yes. And, so that when we talked to Scott Cook about what he saw in Bill and what caused him to hire Bill as the Intuit CEO was more about people. He said Bill had a real appreciation for people. And I think this gets back to football coaching. Like Bill really was a coach first and foremost, and that's part of what impressed Scott. And you're right. In general, a lot of what we haven't talked about in the book was Bill's ability to build trust with people and to get to know them as people before you get into the business stuff.
Yeah, in the book it comes through that he had a style of talking to you about your family and your kids and what's going on in your life, but in a way that was a kind of a step beyond the transactional, like, hey, how's the kids? But like recalling what the kids had been up to, what was going on, what you did with your weekend. It was really... In the book, it comes out that he does that even with incredibly important, busy people he would think don't have time for that. He kind of figured out a way to make the time for that, I guess.
Yeah, we talked to one of the people we talked to was Sundar Pichai, who's Google's CEO now. And, Sundar called it the lovely reset. He'd get into he had his one-on-one coaching sessions, and Bill coached Sundar for years, well before he was CEO of Google. way back when he was a group product manager. He started working with Bill, probably a director, I would guess. And Sundar said, look, you'd be really busy and you'd come in to your meeting with Bill and you'd have a lot of stuff to talk about. But first, Bill would sit down and say, what'd you do this weekend? How are the kids? How's, and like you said, more than just transactional. And, as Sundar said, it was a lovely reset. It was a way to sort of stop and pause and think about what's important.
It's just amazing. And
it's kind of this superpower that any of us can do.
Right.
It doesn't require a lot of skill to say, how's the family, and really actually mean it.
Right.
Did you guys do that thing you talked about you were going to do?
Right.
How'd that go?
There's a few people who do that with me, like not many, but when they do it, it really strikes you. You're like, I forgot that I told you that, but thanks for remembering.
Yeah.
How did you first meet and start to work with Bill? How did you?
So I was not one of Bill's coachees. Right. I met Bill several times because I worked very closely with Jonathan and Eric, and it was inevitable if you work with those guys, you're going to see Bill Campbell.
Yeah.
And, when you would see Bill or you'd be introduced to him, hey, like Bill was really a fuller than life guy who loved life and, really came across that way. Gave you a, big handshake, gave you a big hug, cursed a little bit, told a joke. He's kind of that guy, like just an immediate rapport. And that was my experience with him as well.
And what do you think is sort of the essence of his leadership? Like what makes him him? What makes him the guy that all these people showed up for at this memorial on this sunny day in Northern California?
The essence of it, I think, is threefold. And this really gets down to, what makes Bill Bill, and what can we learn from him?
Yeah.
Because what I don't want people to take away is that he was such a remarkable and unusual guy that no one else can be Bill. And that's true. No one else can be Bill.
Right.
But a lot of the things that we learned from Bill and from we talked to over 80 people who worked with Bill. And a lot of those things we think, look, anyone can do. Right. You can't be Bill, but you can learn from his principles. And the principles there's sort of three categories. One, be a good manager. So if you want to be a good leader, you have to start by being a good manager. Run a tight ship. Know how to run a one-on-one. Know how to run a staff meeting. Especially know how to run a decision-making process. So get the basics right. Then build trust with people, listen to them, be completely present when you listen to them. So many of us start formulating our answers while the other person's talking.
Right.
Don't do that. Just wait. Build trust, be honest. People actually like it when you're honest with them, even if you're giving them negative feedback. It actually boosts them in most cases. So build trust. And then the third one, and this was really interesting to me, is the amount of times the word love came up in our conversations.
I noted in the book. It's notable in the book.
Yeah. People said, I loved Bill. Bill loved me. And these are guys talking about, a guy's guy, sort of guy. But
sure.
It's, it's just a deeper level of caring for the people that you work with.
And did that enable some of there's some kind of dramatic moments. One is with the Chegg CEO, where Chegg is a company backed by Kleiner Perkins, a Silicon Valley venture firm, and it wasn't doing great. And their CEO comes in and turns it around, basically saves it. And then Bill comes in, I'm paraphrasing poorly, I'm sure, but kind of yells at him for and his point is sort of like, yeah, you turned it around, nobody cares. People want a high growth firm.
Yeah.
So he's like, you've done something, but rather than everyone else was walking in to compliment this CEO, go, good job, he's like, you haven't done anything yet, kid. Something allowed him to do that to a CEO.
That's a great story. It was Dan Rosenzweig.
Right.
And, we went over and talked to Dan over in his office, and he loves that story because, like you said, he had inherited a pretty bad situation, and they got to the point where they had basically stabilized the company. They weren't growing, but they weren't about to go out of business. And, it's an important milestone. Dan was quite proud of that. And Bill shows up in the office wearing an accountant's eye shade. Remember those green things? You don't see them anymore, but it was these big green ugly things. And Bill was wearing one. And Dan's like, what the heck is Bill doing? And Bill walks around. And it was always, according to Dan, it was always sort of a party when Bill arrived because he'd walk around. And he didn't just coach Dan, he coached his entire staff. Sure. And he'd go around and he'd greet people. And then, Bill finally walks into Dan's office, and Dan's like, what's with the accounting thing? And he goes, well, your accountants must be very happy. You've saved the company. but you're not growing the company. So, and he sort of took the eye shade and chucked it at him. So it was a way to deliver kind of a tough message, like you're only halfway there, but in a funny way that, people laughed at, and Bill laughed, and Dan Rosenzweig laughed at it, but then realized, let's not celebrate too much.
And it seems like he would do this with anybody, like even with Eric Schmidt. I think there was a point where Google was going public, and he suggested that Eric, I forget, step aside as chairman,
I don't think he was funny in that one, in that conversation. There was no eye shades. But that was a situation where right before the Google IPO, the board had actually asked Eric to step aside as chairman. Okay. And I don't know that, I think, it was obviously public that Eric stepped aside as chairman.
Yes.
But the full story was never told. And so even I didn't know the story when we were talking about it. We'd meet, every other week to talk about the book, and Eric just started telling us the story. And that the board wanted him to step aside as chairman, but to stay as CEO. Yeah. Eric had been both for about 3 years. And, Eric said his feelings were hurt. And, there's a lot of money involved. And, of course, you're thinking, well, who cares about feelings? You're making so much money. Right. But no, his feelings were hurt. He thought he'd done a great job. He thought he did not deserve this, quote unquote, demotion, or what Eric called it, I think, the de-chairmaning. And
clever.
And he called Bill, and he goes, Bill, this is going on. They want me to step aside as chairman. And Bill said, what do you think? And Eric said, I'm quitting. I'm going to resign.
Wow.
Not as chairman, but also as CEO. Okay. I'm mad. I'm hurt. I'm quitting.
So pretty serious crossroads
stuff
now for Google here.
And, but Bill kind of talked him off the cliff and made him realize that would actually hurt the company. That would actually be bad for Eric. And that, Bill, I think, agreed with Eric that Eric had done a fine job as chairman. The board perhaps was, not, who knows where they were coming from. But Bill basically said, Eric, step aside as chairman for now. You'll be reinstated later. You'll work your way back into it. And that's what they did.
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
He came back as chairman, I think, about 3 years later in about 2007.
Wow.
This happened in 2004.
So thinking back to how Bill Campbell got started, how was his being a football coach for 12 years, do you think, impacting? Is that where this comes from, this sort of incredible sense of how to deal with a guy like Eric Schmidt and not be intimidated and solve a problem? Like,
Bill really saw business as a team sport. You can't get anything done without a team. That's what Bill Campbell would say frequently. And, he understood, we actually came to see this through the writing of the book, that, really teams are the building blocks of successful companies. Great teams do great things. But you really can't have a great team without a team that really acts as a community, that they really come together for the good of the team. They will put aside their personal interests. So in that case, that anecdote we were just talking about when Eric stepped aside as chairman, it was really about coming together for the good of the team. Eric to take this de-chairmaning, as he put it, for the good of the team and to keep the team together. Yeah. And so I think Bill saw everything in the context of the team, and that's from football.
So some lessons that maybe people can take away from this, because of course the question is, well, okay, I can buy the book, I guess, but Bill's not around, so what do I do?
Please do.
Please buy the book, $1 Trillion Coach. There's a concept that he did not like consensus, which seems kind of counterintuitive. What did he mean by that? He didn't like consensus.
I hate consensus. If anyone's ever heard Bill, he kind of growled.
Right.
He sort of had a grouchy coaching way of talking. He would. I hate, to sum it up, making decisions is not about consensus. It's about getting to the best idea. Very different approaches. When Bill took over as CEO of Intuit, they used to vote in meetings, and he stopped that. And this was really, I mentioned it earlier as part of how to be a good manager, how to operate your business well, and part of it is decision making. So what does that mean? Consensus, not best idea. Best idea, not consensus. Make sure everyone's perspective is heard. Make sure everyone is listened to. Look around the table and look at the people who are not speaking up. Oftentimes they know their stuff better or as well as anyone else, but for some reason they're not speaking up. Draw them out. If not in the meeting, then after the meeting.
Because the guy who's speaking up is just the guy who's good at speaking up.
Right. Or maybe stronger at advocating their position. Right. But it may not be the best idea.
Right.
So, what's really important is that everyone feels like they're heard. If the decision doesn't go their way, if they feel like they're heard, they could still get on board. So one, make sure everyone's perspective is heard. Two, lots of times the best idea will emerge. Sometimes you might pair people up and have them go work on it and come back at the next meeting. And lots of times the best idea emerges. And then if it doesn't, though, the manager's got to make the decision. Right. A made decision, even if it's the wrong one, is often better than dilly-dallying and not making a decision. So, what emerges out of this process is that a manager, you can't guarantee you're making the right decision, but you can guarantee you're running a good, tight process. You're running the right process to get there.
There's something in the book, and I know I can't articulate this well, but there's something that he seemed to be saying about leadership versus being a manager. Are those things different?
Well, our quote is, what is it? Your title makes you a manager, your people make you a leader. Mm. And I sort of think of it as an equation. Management plus coaching equals leadership. But in the book, what we mean is you start by running a good, tight business. You can't be a leader until you're a really strong manager. You operate a good business, like I said before, running good meetings, running a good decision-making process. And if you do that, you will garner respect from people. And then that respect sort of elevates you to a leadership position. So, Bill really didn't like people who would sort of go in claiming to be a leader and, trying to sort of push that on their people. His point was be humble, run a good business, and then your people will elevate you with their respect to being a leader.
Right. And can a manager then be a coach as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's really our core thesis of the book. But it's a conscious decision you have to make. And these principles that we're talking about, Bill's principles, care for people, build trust, run a good decision-making process, it's not that hard when you read it. They're pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to do in practice.
It's more in the doing than the thinking about it, isn't it?
But sometimes as a manager, sometimes you're running your management hat and you're looking at your dashboard and you're checking your performance of your team. And sometimes you're meeting with your people and you put on your coaching hat. And that's all about, how are you doing? How can I help you? Right. How can I help you grow? Right. That sort of thing.
And what do you think were the top couple things that you learned from Bill or from people who passed it on to you from having worked with him? What do you think were kind of the key lessons you've taken away from him or from living with him for a bit in the book?
Yeah. I did live with Bill in the book. We talked to people for probably over an 18-month span, lots of people, and thought about Bill a lot. And again, the thing that surprised me is the word love and how it came up and how it's changed my approach as a manager is just to take the time to care about the people on your team. Stop and chat with them. You're always running between meetings. You're always running back to your desk to do the next thing, and stop and say, how's it going?
Yeah.
How was your commute this morning? What's up with your kid? That sort of thing. If someone, I've had people on the team, their kids get sick, ask about the kid. Just take a minute. It's not hard to do, but in a busy business day, you have to stop and take the time to do it.
That's incredible. So what do you hope that readers...
It's not incredible. It's just being human.
It's incredible. What I mean is...
But it's hard to do.
It's incredible that we're saying, hey, by the way, stop and, kind of be a little bit human.
Well, maybe it's just me, but, I'm always, you're always productive. How do I get more productive during my day? And it's actually just worth taking the time to breathe a minute and say hi to people.
So what, kind of wrapping up here a little bit, what can readers kind of hope to get out of the book? How can they sort of change their way of working after because it's unusual in the management books that I've read, and that it's such a human story, and that, again, as I've said, as the book starts, so many important people have clearly benefited from this guy. What do you think people are going to benefit from as they get this book?
Well, I mean, first of all, Bill was the probably most successful executive coach of all time.
Hence the $1 trillion.
Hence the $1 trillion. $1 trillion, well over $1 trillion. If he was as instrumental to the growth of Google as anyone else. And probably you could say the same thing about Apple. When Steve Jobs came back in 1997, I think it was, as CEO of Apple, and I think the entire board stepped down, and Bill was the first new board member that Steve brought on. Yeah. So they really partnered to build that company too. So his influence is well over $1 trillion in market cap. But what can people learn? That to be a great leader, you need to be a great manager and a great coach. And to be a great coach, there's a few simple principles that you can learn from Bill. And you can read our book, and you can start doing this tomorrow. Yeah. It's not that hard. It's just a few simple things that you have to pay attention to. And that's what I hope people take away. Adding coaching to management makes you a much better leader and, creates much more effective teams. Plus, it's more fun. It's just a nicer, it's just more enjoyable to come to work when you really care about the people you work with.
That's right. Well, it's a fantastic book, and thank you for spending some time with me.
That's been my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to talk about us and our book.
So Alan Eagle is one of the authors of $1 Trillion Coach. Thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Very much.
This is the Something Venture Podcast. See you.